Thank you so much.
Absolutely. All right. Yeah, so we're recording.
All right, thank you so much. Hi, this is Shadi, and today I have a very special guest with me, Mr. Robert Drysdale, UFC legend, MMA Jiu-Jitsu legend, and the creator of the film Closed Guard. He is here with me. Thank you so much for your time and for doing this and for reaching out to me. I am very humbled and very happy that you decided to do this. Welcome.
Thank you, Chedi. Thank you for the opportunity. It's my pleasure, my honor to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the film that we're working on. And yeah, thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. I've watched some of your podcasts and some of your interviews, and we're not gonna go over the Maeda Carlos. I think you've talked about this quite a few times, and I don't want to repeat the same subject. But recently, you came out with a statement talking about the Kozen Judo part of the film. This is something that I'm personally interested in since I'm a judoka myself. And you stated that you're going to show that throughout the 20th century, the majority of the 20th century, there was no difference. Um, my question is, it's not going to be like, tell me what it is. Obviously not. But um, which angle are you approaching this particular aspect of the movie, the judo part? Is it just they had the sweeps, they had the guards and the techniques, so there it is, or is there something, another message you want to convey?
Yeah, I think that the message is, for me personally, the overall message that the theme of the film was one of, not only questioning our roots, but trying to draw something out of this that we can learn about the future. To me, the main lesson was how much BJJ is orphan in terms of culture and I would say a philosophy. I would say something that I can relate to personally on a more mature level beyond the surf culture that is so entrenched in BJJ. Like that was the ultimate lesson. And we learned that. I had been to Japan before. I'd been to Japan maybe 4 or 5 times before this documentary trip. But it was visit. I remember well the moment where like it kind of dawned on me like how different we were in terms of culture. When I walked into Kosen Judo in Tokyo University, there's a Kosen class taught by Sensei Matsubara, and we got there 30 minutes early to set up equipment, right? Which is more or less how much time we need, about 45 minutes, 30 minutes to set up equipment. And, but there were students there already. They were 30 minutes early, which coming from a Brazilian jiu-jitsu background, that's not very common.
Yeah.
Not only that wasn't that they were early, but their gis were very, very clean and everything was they look all brand new. But my favorite part is they automatically picked up a broom and started sweeping the mats. Now, these were black belts doing that, right? These were not, like, if I ask a white belt of mine to sweep my mats, he'd probably look at me like I'm crazy, right? It's a very different approach to martial arts, right? There in the West, it is heavily influenced by, a capitalistic approach. Like, this is a business, I'm a customer kind of mentality. Whereas in Japan, you get that master-student relationship, a hierarchy of respect that
Right.
I see very little of it in BJJ, if anything at all, right? And the more the sport grows, the less I see that. So I think that is the main lesson that I took. Another one is a question in regards to, I personally don't feel the means by which BJJ evolved out of, and when I say evolved, I'm not talking technically, I'm talking as a different sport, like a different rule set, a different environment, different culture, right? It's a different martial art, I think we can say, even if technically it's very similar. It differs in too many ways at this point. But I feel that, it's that old question: do you justify the end, the means by the end? Like, is it okay that we have a martial art that did not always have the most noble of means to exist? In my opinion, there was a lot of marketing, a lot of fake fights, a lot of, I would say, ego and narcissism, and all these ingredients are present. All because they don't want to fall within the hierarchy of the Kodokan. But on the other hand, I found my life passion through BJJ. Like, there's a part of me that admires the culture in judo, but I'll be honest with you, I am biased towards BJJ because I like BJJ more than I like judo. right? I like the rules of BJJ more than I like judo, but I'm bi. People can disagree with that. It's a matter of opinion. So at the same time, it's a bit of a conflict because as much as I love BJJ, I came to admire the culture in judo a lot more than I admire the culture in jiu-jitsu. So, and it's somewhat of a conflict, I guess, but not everything out of something this complex is going to be a conclusion. You're going to walk out of something this complex with questions as well as conclusions.
Right. So there's a part in the film where you go and show the difference, like the culture. For example, one simple aspect, it's very apparent, is you have one people they bow and you have one people they slap and bump.
Yeah.
So some call sensei and some like call him by his first name.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And even like in the United States, for example, I think it's drifted even further away from that. Like they don't even bow to enter the mats. In Brazil, you had to bow to enter the mats. So there was something
Right.
Japanese left, right? In the US, like wrestling and boxing have had such an impact in the martial arts culture in the United States. It's hard to train people to bow to enter on the mats. Even myself, I forget sometimes because like I got used to the MMA world, right? Where you don't bow to enter the mats, you just enter the mats and train, right? So these little changes, I think they're interesting to note, like on a personal level, like these were the things that I took personally. They don't fit into the film because it would be too extensive to talk about cultural differences, right? But what we did focus on was the reason why we brought Kosen Judo into the documentary is not because Kosen Judo played a role in BJJ, the development of BJJ. It's because Kosen Judo precedes BJJ in many of its conclusions, right? So, for example, this is this is not as a film producer or slash historian or anything, like it's more of an opinion as a practitioner. You don't reach these conclusions on the ground of sophisticated groundwork unless you have thousands of hours of practice within a somewhat of a competitive environment. Because for me to have an intelligent solution, I have to try a million ways of doing something wrong before I can figure out something that's highly efficient. And then we can build off that, right? So this is where experience come in. I make all the mistakes for future generations that has a selected canon of the most efficient techniques to work with, and they will select from those. So we're getting more and more specific about our techniques and better as we go. So the fact that the Japanese were doing moves that I thought were modern, like De La Riva, X-Guard, like Berimbolos, the fact that they're doing this in the first half of the 20th century suggests to me that outside of the Kodokan rule set, even within that whole grappling scene in Japan, there's a very sophisticated grappling world. As a circuit, I would say maybe probably competitive to some degree, because you don't reach these conclusions unless you're in a competitive environment where it's like an arms race. That's what a gym is, right? There's an arms race going on.
Right.
I'm trying to outdo your technique with better techniques and so on, right? There's a dialogue, there's an argument of technique going on. For me to be winning, I have to be raising the bar all the time. And you end up reaching these conclusions, and they reach these conclusions early in the 20th century, which tells me that Brazilians also reached these conclusions, like not through Kosen Judo on their own, but much, much later. So the main reason why we bring Kosen Judo is to make the point that there was no revolution going on in Brazil. That what separated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from Judo was not a technical revolution. It was a movement of resistance towards Judo. Now, you don't have to like it. You can disagree with the methods, but Carlos and Helio played a huge role in carving a space outside of Judo in Brazil. My personal opinion, they did not want to fall underneath the hierarchy of the Kodokan. They wouldn't. I can't see them. Like Carlos and Helio were leaders. I can't see them falling under the hierarchy of the Kodokan. And they maintain this aspect of Judo, right? I like to call it Brazilian Judo as kind of like, because it's not Jiu-Jitsu, right? It's Judo. But it maintained that aspect alive long enough for it to develop sort of its own culture and environment outside of Judo, right? So it's sort of like a rebel child, you call it that. And much later, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will become more sophisticated at Kosen Judo, but this doesn't take place until the 90s. Like you could watch in the 90s, and after that in the 2000s. Now, I mean, the revolution on the ground we are witnessing now in Jiu-Jitsu is unprecedented. Like I can't even keep up. I've been doing Jiu-Jitsu for 23 years. I'm a full-time coach, practitioner. This is my life. I'm telling you, I can barely keep up with with the evolution because it's happened so quickly. So, but up to the 90s, I strongly believe the Japanese were ahead of the Brazilians in terms of development.
Hmm, interesting. Um, Also, one statement that you said, and I 100% agree with you, it's particularly the rules. For example, judo banned their leg locks in 1923. That's almost a century ago. And neck cranks 1925. That has indirectly, in my opinion, helped the evolution of BJJ on the ground when it comes to leg locks with the whole John Danaher thing, in my opinion. Uh, so my question or my what I'm trying to say is, yes, rules do not play sometimes in the favor of the art. Uh, what do you think now today BJJ or judo needs in terms of rules in order to keep it pushing?
You have to find a balance, right? Like, you can see, and I'm no expert in the history of judo or the Kodokan, but it's clear to me that Jigoro Kano is trying to please the Ministry of Education in Japan by formatting judo to suit the government. You guys want a physical education, you want a sport, so they have to eliminate much of the martial out of judo and blend that in with education. And judo sits somewhere in between. It's a sport, it's educational, but it's also martial. It's also a form of combat, right? And I suspect that the limiting of the rules was to please make it something that the West would accept, that the Ministry
Mm,
of Education in Japan would accept. Um, these were the reasons that led judo, I believe, and there might be some prejudice too, in the sense where I suspect I don't know what Jigoro Kano's skills were like, but I suspect he probably wasn't an expert on the ground. And there's a tendency
no,
as humans, he wasn't, right? Yeah.
no,
And there's a
it came
tendency.
later on.
Yeah, like I mean, his experience is not, from my understanding, right, is not on the ground. He's got a more a broader experience standing, and from my experience, and this is something we all fall victim of. I do, you do. We tend to teach that which we know. We tend to like that which we know. The wrestlers in my gym all want to do stand up. The jiu-jitsu guys want to play guard, and then you got the guys that only want to do leg locks, and then you get the guys that like the berimbolos. Everyone thinks that real fighting is what they know best, and that's normal, right? It's an enormous effort to escape that. And I have to do this as a coach. I've forced myself to learn and teach things I'm not good at because I have to do it for my students, right? For the well-being of the art and for the quality of my instruction. But I believe that, Jigoro Kano may be influenced by those ideas of being a gentleman. It was very in vogue at the time, stand upright, clean, the ground is filthy. You can see there's a prejudice towards the ground. I suspect because he didn't know it well. And he, probably limiting the submissions because submissions give an untrained eye the impression that they are dangerous. When in
Yes.
reality, and I say this, I can't prove it. It's my opinion. I don't have any evidence to back this up. It really is my opinion. What hurts people the most are transitions because they're not in control. Yeah, a submission is in control of two people. One can tap and the other one can give the other person time to tap, right? It's not, most of my injuries have not come via submission. They have come via takedown and transitions. I'm trying to sweep. I come up in a funny way. I tweak my knee, right? Like it's always that uncontrollable scramble that causes most of the injuries. So to me, the argument that limiting wrist locks and leg locks is for safety purposes is not a good argument. I understand why they would make it because it seems that way. And I've made this case with IBJJF. IBJJF makes a similar mistake now, in my opinion, as the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation. They don't allow heel hooks. And I've always made the case that heel hooks should be allowed. And they're worried about the injury ratio, which is a good concern because the heel is a very short lever. There's not a lot of, it's like a wrist. There's not a lot of time to tap, right? On top of that, because it's a rotational motion, the injury is not linear. So if you pop your elbow, it's a linear injury. It's not the same as a rotational injury, right? Which, it tears things different. Right? I'm no, physical
Right.
therapist, but like it's a very severe injury. It takes a long time to recover. So I think there is an argument there. On the other hand, I think that most injuries don't come from submissions, even heel hooks. They're not. You do have time to tap. It takes training to learn how to tap preemptively, and it's something you can train. I know this for a fact because I've always allowed it in my gym. And every once in a blue moon, we have an injury. It's not most of our injuries. I'm telling you, they come from transitions.
Right.
On top of that, I feel that BJJ will make the same mistakes judo made, and I mean this respectfully. of limiting techniques, and you lose on the martial end of the spectrum in favor of the sport. And at some point, we have to find that balance. I lean towards the martial. I know I'm probably, more, less concerned with, I'm more concerned with performance than I am with health. I would say that, and not everyone should agree with me. And I'm not saying I'm correct, but it is my position. I think that BJJ will be a more complete art with heel hooks in the gi, including. I think it should be legal in the gi. I think judo lost by limiting, the scope of their submissions on the ground. I think that we would have more judo. The BJJ would not have existed had there been more time on the ground in judo with more submissions. There would have been no space. I truly believe that BJJ exists within the space that the Kodokan, not completely neglected, right, but neglected to some extent. They preferred, it became more stand-up. And that space is where BJJ came to be.
Yeah, and you have also the fact that in Kozen or Nanate Judo, they're kind of secluded. They're in the 7 imperial universities only, and they compete amongst themselves in team format, and that's it. They just don't get out of their shell. That will also help, in my opinion.
Yeah, we had a brilliant, a great interview with Yuki Nakai. Was probably one of my favorite interviews, man. And he said something that really, it was like one of those light bulb moments. I mean, I couldn't understand him. I don't speak Japanese. I had to read the transcripts later, right? But I remember, and like the question was, what was the feeling in Japan once they saw Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Because Yuki Nakai is interesting because he had a Kosen experience. He fought Shuto, and later he becomes absorbed by Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he becomes president of the Japanese Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, which is, I love that term, Japanese Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation, right? But he says like the impression was one of surprise. They had no idea that there were Brazilians that were good at judo, and to them it was judo, it wasn't jiu-jitsu. In Brazil, they had no idea that there had been a scene in Brazil of Vale Tudo and specialization on Newaza, and it was followed by a sense of fear. It was like, man, these guys are really good. Where do these guys come from, right?
Yeah.
And there's a feeling also of nostalgia, of feeling like they had lost something after the war, that Japan had neglected something. They had something that was special, was important, but they had neglected it. And, it had to be imported back to Japan for them to appreciate it, right? And now they accept the term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I think is incredibly humble. I was just thinking about this the other day. You see this in a debate in the U.S. over American Jiu-Jitsu. Like, I've never been a fan of BJJ, to be honest, because Brazilians never called it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm fine with Jiu-Jitsu. I don't like the nationalistic card in martial arts. I think it should stay out of martial arts, my personal opinion.
Right.
BJJ, I'm not crazy about. We use it because it's easier to identify what we're talking about. I think American Jiu-Jitsu is pushing it because I don't see anyone doing it in the United States anything different than it's being done in Brazil. I think we're all doing the same thing, right? But it's interesting to me that the people that could make a claim for Japanese Jiu-Jitsu because they're better positioned to do it never have. They're perfectly accepting of the term Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And to me, that shows a lot of humility, and I think that's something that, I'm wondering if Americans had created something, if we would be okay had it been, if it had developed in Guatemala or Mexico and it comes back to the United States later, if Americans, knowing that they had invented it, would be okay with calling it Mexican Jiu-Jitsu, for example. I just don't see that.
No.
So it has a degree of maturity and humility, I would say, that is, it's like, once again, going back to the original question, something I came to admire. So, Kosen is interesting to me because the reasons why they resist Kodokan are in some ways similar to why Brazilians resisted, in the sense where, they see something, that the ground is important. You can't have one without the other. For the purposes of combat, what's the point of being an expert on the ground if you can't take someone down? What's the point of taking someone down if you don't know what to do when you get there?
Exactly. It's all tied up.
You can't. I mean, why would you even? Why it drives me. Like, I've been a guard player my whole life. You can watch my jiu-jitsu matches. When I got heavier, I became more of a top player. But most of my jiu-jitsu career, all I did was pull guard. The idea of exchanging takedowns with someone terrified me. Right. So it may sound like I'm a hypocrite here, but I am in favor of guard pulling being penalized. Like, it should be penalized with a -1. That would make perfect strategical sense to me because, in traditional IBJJF rules, if we're on the ground and you disengage and back out, you're penalized because you are disengaging from the ground fight. If we're both standing and you disengage from the stand-up fight and you pull guard, why don't we apply the same criteria? We wouldn't have to create a criteria. It already exists. You just have to apply it on both ends of the spectrum, right? So it is a mistake that BJJ makes as well. And, but Kosin resistance, that's what's so interesting because, there's a debate. I was just reading about this. I don't remember where. Apparently there was a debate that went back and forth between Oda Tsunetane and the Kodokan about the importance of the ground. I'd love to read that. I'm sure I can find it somewhere at some point. But it's interesting to me that, they resisted because they think, no, this is important. And we're going to keep doing it probably because they liked it. And I think that's another motivation people don't talk about. It's not just about the evolution of the art. It's also what people like.
It is my preference too. As a judoka, I like the ground myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the Kosin judokas, it's strange because they kept the term judo. They use the term judo, but it's a curiosity, outside of the Kodokan because it is limited. It's something that almost dies in Japan, similar in Brazil. As judo in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's steamrolling through any martial art in its way. Like it is growing rapidly because it's so organized, it's so well structured. And Jigoro Kano hit the nail on the head by making it something that governments would approve of. Like it was a brilliant move by him. And that's, becoming an Olympic sport, like that catapulted judo to this day, probably the most practiced martial art in the world. And, it was a brilliant move. But like, it's interesting that the Kosen, just like in Brazil, it almost dies throughout this growth of the Kodokan official rule set, the Olympic rule set. But they resisted, they stayed in there, they hung in there. And now it's having a huge comeback to the point where in France, which probably they're more Japanese than the Japanese in terms of like how they like their judo. I know like how influential the French Federation is in terms of like other sports, other martial arts. And
I live in France. You don't have to tell me.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've been traveling. I've been going to France since 2005, right? 5, 6 for seminars. And I remember then it's like, oh, the French Federation won't allow jiu-jitsu tournaments. I'm like, what do you mean they don't like? How can they ban that? Like, to me, that's crazy, right? But they finally conceded, and now they're organizing Newaza tournaments, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah.
Right? Because they won't. I mean, I understand why they don't want to call it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they can't. The fact that there's a calling, there's a need, there is a comeback. That ground fight has had, and it's through the UFC and it's through the Gracie family. You got to give them credit. They played a huge role in boosting this comeback in the mid '90s. And
the marketing was
the marketing was brilliant, but it was important because without the marketing, I wouldn't have the job. So I don't like marketing. I think good things market themselves. The wheel did not need marketing. It was brilliant invention. It marketed it. Right? If it's good, it doesn't need marketing. That's how I see things. But Rorion was brilliant in the sense where it was bullseye with the UFC. It couldn't have been better, right? And this comeback is something that we're all thankful for.
Yeah, that's another thing is that they don't market. For one good example, the triangle choke. The triangle choke was invented in 1922 by a student named Masaru Hayakawa and his professor called Kanemitsu. So what happened was Tsunetane Oda, his team, he was the coach, and it's a high school Kozen rivalry. So what happened was they developed it in order to beat Tsunetane Oda's team, and it was invented in 1922. But in 1929, 7 years later after its invention, Oda puts it in his book, and now he's credited for the triangle choke, the invention. So it's like they don't even care that it's in his book and he's taking the credit or he's marketing it. They just don't care almost.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually have on an Oda Tsunetane book, Judo on the Ground. I don't know. Yeah, I actually that book my great uncle accidentally. He knew I did martial arts, and he gave me the only martial arts book he had, and it turned out to be Oda Tsunetane, which is pretty cool. No, I think it is fascinating. That period in Japan to me is very interesting. Like I know very little about it, admittedly. Like it's not something I ever really looked into. But it's interesting because I think in some ways it resembles what we're going through now. There's a big commotion in the martial arts world and what's the ideal rule set, and there's a lot of debate going on rule set in the grappling world today, right? Like there's this debate between submission only versus points. IBJJF is no good, like we need a better rule set. I think in some ways history is repeating itself, not identically, but
Yeah.
the triangle is just one of many examples of sophistication that the Japanese had. I mean, we heard this from Carlos Gracie Jr., Hobson Gracie, and Flavio Bering. They didn't know what a triangle was until like the late 70s. You see what I'm saying? And the Ono brothers, I mean, there's a picture. The Valenti brothers have an archive, and there's a picture that Helio Gracie gave them. Actually, Helio kept the picture. It's a newspaper article.
Akitaro Ono?
No, Yasuichi Ono, the one that fought
Ah.
Helio twice. Yasuichi Ono applying I don't think Akitaro Ono could apply a triangle to save his life. But Yasuichi Ono is applying a triangle on someone. There's a picture of it, and the newspaper articles from 1935, maybe 36. Can't recall from memory now. So it was in the. I mean, the Onos were doing the triangle in Brazil up to 1935, but the Brazilian / the Gracie, niche, they didn't absorb that. They didn't get that information until like later it was shown to them in like the mid 70s. Apparently, Holds Gracie learned it from a judoka, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know the story exactly of how they learned it, but the description Hobson had of the triangle, he thought it was BS. And someone had to put him in the triangle for like, oh wow, this is really good. But like he had never seen it, and it just confirms like the thesis in the films that like Brazilians did not revolutionize anything. It wasn't later that there was a major revolution in Brazil. And it was because of competition. I always say this, the importance of competition to raise the bar technically. No one creates anything great unless they're under pressure.
Right. Yeah, the need is the mother of all invention.
Yeah,
basically. Yeah,
and that's I used to be more critical of IBJJF when I was younger, but I think that they almost came too late into the sport. That they were crucial because they gave BJJ structure and a body from which the sport could grow on a world level, right?
yeah,
Time belts, ranked systems, trained referees, consistent tournaments. They gave the sport more credibility. I fear that had Carlos Gracie Jr. not founded IBJJF or CBJJ at the time in 1994, what would have happened to BJJ is kind of what happened to catch wrestling. Now, catch wrestling is very efficient. Catch wrestling is very old. Catch wrestling is worldwide. It's been around forever. It's very efficient. There's nothing wrong with it technically,
Josh
right?
Barnett.
It's perfectly efficient. But it was never organized. Like it never grew the way judo grew. Judo grew in a way that it grew out of a cell and it grew from there. Right? It has a matrix. BJJ pursues the opposite route. At first it grows and then it becomes organized. Right?
Yeah.
But IBJJF almost shows in the scene like almost too late, I feel like. I think had they been founded like now, for example, it would have been too late. There would have been no such thing as the worldwide growth we're watching in BJJ. I think it would have split it off into many other sub-styles of different rule sets, different ways of practicing gi versus no gi. It wouldn't have been as unified. And it's not greatly unified. It's still some division. But it would have been less united had it not been for IBJJF.
Yeah, of course. A funny thing you mentioned that history repeats itself. Do you know the whole feud between the Gracie and Fadda family when they organized the tournament?
I did. They had their tournaments. I mean, I know it would like the fathers would like sometimes they would win.
Yeah. The funniest thing is that in the 1800s, like the 1890s, there were constantly competitions in between all jiu-jitsu school because Kano was technically back then Kano Ryu or Kano Jiu-Jitsu. So there was this competition in the Butoku Kai in Kyoto. So there was a jiu-jitsu master that pulled guard and reaped the knee, did the ashigarami, and broke the guy's leg. That was like the 1890s, and everyone was outraged, including Jigoro Kano, and he called for the ban of leg locks. They thought like they were too dangerous. He broke his knee. The classic argument, but and then the ashigarami itself was banned in 1916, and then after the knee bar was actually invented in the same school where the triangle choke came, so they can still also defeat Tsunetane Oda's team. So 1922 they applied the knee bar. The outrage goes once again, like this is like ashigarami, it was already banned, what are you doing? The head referee back then allowed it, but the Kodokan had its meeting 1 year later, 1923, and they decided that the leg locks were officially banned from all programs. Fast forward to the 1950s, the Fadda and the Gracie challenge was happening. And the Fadda team was pulling guard and applying leg locks, and everyone was calling Zapatero, Zapatero. They were outraged, almost like back in the 1890s. So, in a sense, yeah, there is this bad view for leg locks, but in judo it stayed.
It's coming. We're watching it again now in the 21st century. We're watching it again. There's a huge debate on it. And it always comes down to this: that which I don't know is not real jiu-jitsu. You ever notice that?
What do you mean?
Whatever I don't know is not real jiu-jitsu. Whatever I'm good at is real jiu-jitsu. This is selfishness getting in the way of the development of the art. This is me saying, oh, footlocks are no good. Notice that the people who always say that are the people who aren't good at footlocks. 100% of the time. I'll give you an example. One time we had an IBJJF meeting. It's like maybe 5 years ago. And maybe there's like me and some 8 other team leaders and black belts there. And we're discussing the rules, right? We're making some suggestions to change the IBJJF rules, right? And I make a suggestion that I talked about earlier to penalize guard pulling. I mean, you should have seen the expression on Rafael Mendes' face. Like, he almost fell off his chair. Like, it was blasphemy. It's like, how dare you say that? Like, he started laughing at me because my suggestion was so outrageous to him. It was comical. I had some other guys laugh at me. I was laughed at because I suggested that guard pulling should be penalized. Just to give an idea of how people's preferences steer the direction of the sport. It's because, and Rafael Mendes to me is one of the best of all time. I love him to death. I've known him since he was a kid. Kid's phenomenal. But he doesn't know any stand-up. That's why he says that, right? And maybe in his shoes, I'm retired, so maybe I'm a hypocrite because I can say now that I like more stand-up in jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. But when I was competing, I hated stand-up. I just pulled guard because that's where I was good at. I was good at guard player. So
that's the way to get to the ground.
Yeah, but the thing is, whoever is in charge of the sport can't have these biases. If you're in charge of the sport, you have to look at the longevity of the art. If you're responsible for making the rules, you have to think what's best for this sport. What is it that is best? And that's where we steer the sport in that direction. Versus, I don't know footlocks. I'm going to be embarrassed if my students start asking me questions about footlocks because I don't know them. So let's ban them because they're dangerous. You see the justification?
Yeah.
Right? It is a problem that seeks a justification, not a justification for a problem, right?
So it is insecurity. So it's
a lot of that. And as a coach, I say full-heartedly admit this. There's a lot that I don't know. And it's not always easy to admit this in class. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. When I watch Mike Musumeci transition in Berimbaulis, I can barely keep up. The kid is so out there. Like, it's so sophisticated. I have to put it in slow motion. I have to watch it 4 or 5 times before I understand what that kid's doing, right? And, I mean, I admit this because, I mean, my ego, in that sense, I got a massive ego when it comes to training. But when it's stuff like this, it doesn't bother me. Like, it's true. I don't know. But, I'm willing to learn. But it's not always easy to admit to your students that there's someone out there that your neighbor, your competitor, knows more than you do in that regard. It's a business issue as well, because if you say that, your student probably does not have the maturity to understand that you are being humble and instead takes it, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Maybe I should go train with that guy over there because clearly he knows the answer to this question, right? Mm-hmm. Enter the frauds, enter the hoaxes, enter the con artists who act like they know it all, right? And this is, I know the sport inside out, man. Like, I've been in my whole life. I know who's who, and I know when someone knows what they're talking about, and I know when they're full of it. Like, I got a radar for this shit, right? Because I've been here so long. And the best coaches were the ones that, you don't see them. There's no bravado about being ultra knowledgeable because deep down you know that this is too broad of a category to be a really know-it-all kind of thing. Like, it's too dense, right? The people who are always trying to act like they know it all are the ones that, from my experience, they just got good at talking about it, right? Wrapping it up in lots of, complex rhetoric to act like you really know what you're talking about. But if you peel through the layers of the onion and you get to the bottom of what they're saying, there's no experience there. It's just a lot of bravado. And, I think that martial arts ought to come with some humility too. And admit that saying that you don't know is perfectly okay, and students ought to understand that.
Yeah, yeah, of course. The humble part of the martial art that we all claim that our art have, it's the hardest principle to apply.
It's a very, and it's funny because, experience ought to teach you humility, but it's difficult because as you get better and as you move up and you become the alpha dog in the gym, the tendency is your lesser self, it goes, oh, clearly if I can beat everyone, I know more than everyone. I got it all figured out. No one can beat me. I have zero flaws in my game, right? And it's difficult to maintain the mindset of just because I'm beating everyone in practice doesn't mean that I don't have holes in my game. That's where a good coach comes in, right? To constantly remind you that you got many things to learn and you're not, because once you start reaching that level of beating people in practice and you're no longer getting tapped, it's easy to get carried away into that arrogant mindset. It is very, very easy to get carried away. There was a moment there where I thought I knew it all, like, and because I was beating people in practice, it's an enormous effort not to fall into that mindset. But
Yeah,
I truly believe this is the job of the coach, is to put the students in their place, right? That is it's not just teaching your techniques, it's to put you back in your place. That's why being a coach in the 21st century with millennials is so difficult. I have a hard time because they just want to feel good. They call it that what do you call
gratification,
it?
instant gratification.
Yeah, yeah, but there's a name for this, triple M. It's like millennial millionaire mindset. It's like everyone's a millionaire, everyone's a rock star, everyone's superstar, and
Yeah,
it's hard to remind these kids like, hey man, you're still crawling, you're in your infancy, but they don't want to hear it. And I think it's
yeah,
worse. We have never been so far away from Kano's Do. I think we've drifted so far from that in the West, at least, maybe some place. And I think through judo, much of Japanese culture has survived through judo. But in terms of MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is what I'm more familiar with, there's little to nothing of it left.
yeah, yeah. Uh, uh, yeah, and you said that once no one beats you or whatever, it really brings up this ego. That you can see this in the non-competitive arts almost. Uh, I have a background in many arts, and I have seen it in one non-competitive art. But uh, one thing I have thought about this, I don't know if it makes sense, but when it comes to the rules and making the most logical rules, is that the ones that should be applied for self-defense. For example, on the street, no one's going to pull guard. That's the most idiotic thing you can do. Or Hickson, when he says, if you don't know self-defense, you don't know jiu-jitsu, and also you should train in a way that it should work in Vale Tudo.
Yeah. I think that I'm of that opinion. I think that any martial art should try to strive to be as complete as I think that given time, all martial arts will become more and more alike because I think the tendency is for even karate gyms are looking to teach the ground now. I teach striking in my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. People think I'm crazy, but I teach my students how to throw a jab and a right hand with the gi. That's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's like I just made it. Correct. I want to teach my students how to throw a punch if they have to, right? Because, yeah, 90% of the fights in on the ground, true, but 100% start where? Standing. You got to learn how to
Standing.
get your hands up and throw some punches. That is my approach to martial arts. It is the philosophical cornerstone that BJJ lacks and judo has, that respect, that humility, that dough, right? Like that educational aspect of it. But it's also the reality of combat. Like I'm not interested in a watered down, like this is the mistake that many traditional martial arts have made, in my opinion, is that they become so philosophy and respect and discipline oriented, they lost some of the reality of the randori, of the combat, of the, and I want both. Like I don't think that's too ambitious. I think that is perfectly applicable, that is realistic to have a martial art martial art practice that embodies both these things. I would like to see a martial art, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, something that incorporated everything that would work in a street fight, everyone that would work in MMA, and still be able to practice it within a sport format. So you might have to eliminate some of the elbows, you have to eliminate some of the strikes to the head, maybe practice with like small gloves. And I've made this case before. MMA is the closest thing, is the best form of self-defense ever created because it has assimilated the best techniques from all arts. MMA is a laboratory for trying out techniques. It has eliminated many of the things in BJJ that we were taught, learned, and worked in a fight, but they don't. I'll give you an example. Knee on belly. Knee on belly is the most overrated position in history, in my opinion. I don't even know why they score points for it. It's not good control. The only way you're going to control someone knee on belly is if you're heavier and more athletic. Someone of equal athletic ability, you're not going to be able to. Watch the UFC. When was the last time you saw a knee on belly?
No, I
And
don't
there's a
remember.
reason for that. It's not a great position. There are other positions that are very important in real fight that are underplayed in martial arts. I'll give you an example. Turtle position. Most important position on the ground. I would rather be an expert at attacking turtle than an expert in guard. And there's this hyper focus on guard.
Oh, where they're like turn their heads in.
Because watch the UFC. That's the most common TKO position comes from that position because it's such a dominant position. It is more dominant than mount. Everyone's mount. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has that thing, right? Mount. And I'm like, I don't think mount is that position in a fight. Watch the UFC. When was the last time you saw a KO begin in mount? Or a TKO for that matter, right? It's very rare. But how many TKOs do you see from turtle position? So my MMA fighters, I train them more oriented towards controlling the turtle position than fighting for a mount, which I don't think is a great position for MMA, for example. So this martial arts practice has to be based on reality. And the UFC has been that because it has weeded out the bullshit. It has given us what actually works in a real fight. Elbows work, right? Clinching, wrestling, single leg, double, body lock, great. Back attack, rear naked choke, #1 submission of all time. Rear naked choke, back is king. Most important position, turtle to back. It's the #1 sequence to submission in MMA, jiu-jitsu in the gi, and jiu-jitsu no gi. What does that say? Like, this is the crux of what we're doing, man. And like people, it's not that we ignore it, but people don't focus on that for purposes of self-defense. But that would be where you would begin with an efficient self-defense system, starting with what has been proven to work consistently throughout history.
That's so amazing you mentioned this. Like one of the like desperate or Hail Mary defense mechanism in judo, especially when they lose the grip fighting and their posture is all broken, is they drop down and they turtle.
Yeah.
So now there's way too many exercises to break the turtle. Like you can do a triangle from the turtle. But back attacks in judo are not very common because they're all interested in like reverse and pinning.
Yeah.
Like they just love to win with the pin. That's so amazing that you mentioned this because, for example, I'm against turtling because in a street fight you just get your head stomped, for example.
Horrible. Yeah. I think it is, and this is where judo has drifted too far away from the martial end of the spectrum. It has become too much of a sport because in a real fight, if you turtle up, we all saw what happened in Pride when you went to turtle position like that. You get soccer kicked, and in a real fight, you're going to get soccer kicked, right? It's just the UFC banned soccer kicks, so we don't see them anymore. But in a real fight, that's not a good position. You are better off in guard. I'll give you another example. You know why?
Yes.
You know why Damian Maia was so successful in MMA? I'll tell you why. I know Damian well. You know why? I'll tell you why. Because he lets people stand back up. You know why? Because everyone gives the back to stand back up. And I'm like, you idiots. That's all he wants. He doesn't want to pin you. Why would you want to be in mount or side control in a fight? They're horrible positions to finish and do damage from.
It's uncomfortable.
It's hard to do damage in side control. It's hard to do damage in mount. On the back, it's easier to do damage, and it's much easier to finish you. That's where the rear naked choke comes in. So if you watch Damian and the guys who actually played guard with them, they did okay. They didn't do that bad. They didn't expose their backs. The guys who try to stand back up with them on the fence, which is what every MMA fighter is taught, right? Use the fence to stand back up. It's like, you don't understand. With guys like Khabib and Damian, that's what they want.
Yeah.
They want trying to stand back up because that's exactly what. And I didn't fight that much, but my experience was the same. Like when I would take people down on the fence, I never try to hold them down. I would let them stand back up so I can take the back because I would rather be there. That's where I want to be, is on the back, right? So like little things that martial artists aren't. The martial arts in general have neglected, and MMA has single-handedly been the best thing for martial arts, I believe, because it has given us the it has given us the technical canon of what are the most efficient techniques in the world, and we're just missing the other half. We just got to get rid of show business to have that other half be a,
Stay true.
yes, it's hard to do because money corrupts everything, you know.
Yeah.
But but like I would like to see the humility that I saw in the Kosen Judo schools in Japan in MMA as well.
Yeah, that's yeah, like the press conference and like they're just out clearly selling tickets with the press conference, the smack talking. Yeah.
Yes,
Uh, and the class after like you sweep the class, how was it? Were you comfortable? How was the rolling, etc.? I'm
uh,
very curious.
I deeply regret not taking a gi with me, and I know because the thing it was such a rush. If I give you the Japan schedule wasn't that crazy. The Brazil schedule was insane, man. We were sleeping 4 hours a night for 2 weeks straight. It was
Mm.
insane. Like car, bus, train, luggage, equipment, up flight of stairs, down flight of stairs. Dude, it was madness. All right, Japan was a little bit easier, but it was still tight. And there was nowhere to shower. I mean, I don't know if there's. I mean, I wasn't invited, so I was there as a producer. I felt that would have been somewhat selfish to hold back the production in order to get some rounds in.
Man.
There's a part of me that regrets it because I would have loved to have rolled with them. They were all very young kids, like 18, 19, 20, because they're in university, so they all would have to be that young, right? What was interesting is that a couple of them, you know, they knew me from competition. They knew the jiu-jitsu competition scene well. And that's what I thought was so interesting is that once again, their humility of knowing that they had done it first, but they had no issues looking up to Brazilians like Leandro Lowe. They had no issues admiring these guys, and those were their technical references because they knew who they were. I was blown away. I was shocked. But they would follow the BJJ scene because, as I see it, I'm sure they would agree, there are no major differences between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Kosen Judo. I mean, what are realistically, what are the differences? You know, like you can barely see, maybe in the rules, how we emphasize this over that because of the rules. But in general terms, it's the same thing. So it's not surprising that I would, you know, that I would learn from a Kosen Judo book. It's funny because Leo Vieira, my coach, he had a Kosen Judo book, and he showed it to me. It would have been like 2002, 3. And I was shocked. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, they had some really cool chokes from Side Control that I had never seen before. I was blown away. And so, yeah, like you would learn. Like, it's a different experience. And, you know, you can learn from it either way, like either end, either Kosen or BJJ. I'm sure that I would learn a lot had I spent some time training with them.
Yeah. Wow. You know, what would be really interesting to see, in my opinion, that's one of the things that I think about when I'm like doing nothing. Every year, if on uh, October 23rd, when Kimura met Elio Gracie, like if you do the same, you'd have like a judo team and you'd have a BJJ team, both in the gi. One is demonstrating the bowing, etc., and like how they come up with all the respect and the humility, and the Brazilians come in, or it doesn't have to be a Brazilian team per se, but a BJJ culture style, and they would just go head to head as a tradition. That would be like so amazing. It would show everything, differences in like the mannerism, the technique,
Yeah.
just how they conduct themselves. I think that would be amazing idea to have this kind of tournament every year.
I would love to do something like that. I think it's a very interesting idea. And it's funny because like we're talking about Yuki Nakai. I remember when I visited him, it was like right after the Kosen Judo school in Tokyo University. And if it was still Japan, you know, it was a different age bracket, older people. They were in their
Yeah,
30s, right? The Kosen Judo practitioners were all like, you know, teens and early 20s.
yeah,
But it was a very different demeanor on the mat. Even though we were still in Japan, and everyone was very respectful. It's important that I say this, but they were very relaxed. Like people didn't show up exactly on time. They took their time to take their fingers. The bow, there was fist bump. It was not bowing, even though we were in Japan. But it was interesting when you observe that even like judo has been a vehicle for Japanese culture to spread around the world, right? The bowing is something that till this day, people in the UFC, they bow, right? You see that as it is traveled the world. But I believe that the acai culture, the fist bump, the relaxed manners is Brazil, and it's traveled the
yeah.
world because I saw that when I was in Chechnya. I saw that, and I've seen it in Australia, and this time I saw it in Japan. right? Like
Wait, you saw acai bowl in all like the places you went?
I have never been to a BJJ school where the mannerism was like judo. It's always been very surf culture, flip flops, board shorts, like
Yeah,
fist bump, acai, and I think that is very appealing in some ways. But I also think as you, because it is very attractive. So, but I believe that as you get older, as BJJ matures the martial art, we're missing something else that we can relate to because I, you know, I don't condemn people who, act that way, but I would like the martial art to have some, if I don't think identical to judo is the point, but I think that you have to show some respect to the mats and bowing. This is a sacred place. It's not the floor. It's not the floor. The mats. There's a difference, right?
yeah.
I would like to see the respect for the elders. Like getting older now has made me gain so much more respect for people who are 50 plus and training because it was easy to train twice a day when I was 20. I'm 38. It's not easy to train once a day. Sometimes like I go 2 days without training because my knees hurt too much. I got two herniated discs. So it's an enormous effort. It's a very courageous act even for someone who's
Mhm.
willing to step on the mats daily. So I would like to see that respect, right? Like we've lost so much the trash talking. We don't need that, man. We don't need that. But it's permeated not only MMA, but now BJJ as well. So these are the things that these are the I guess the lessons from this whole production. It's been a fun theme, man. It's unfortunate we can't fit it all in the film. It's just the film touches on a little bit of everything we talked about, but it doesn't go in depth in anything.
Maybe you could have like made it into like a small docu-series that would have like you could fit in everything.
You know how much post production costs? I didn't know this. Not a lot of people know. Post production can cost. It's not unusual. Not just filming, just a post production. $100,000 an hour.
Oh my
So
God.
5 episodes, we're talking $500,000 here.
Oh my God.
So it's very expensive. If you're going to do it right, it's very expensive. And I have material for 10 films, probably. Like we have, I think, something like 40,000 gigabytes of information. We have
Wow.
footage.
That's amazing. So there's gonna be like unseen footage or uncut scenes.
So what we're going to do is I plan on using some material, some conclusions, and some information that did not fit into the film into a book. I've just recently finished it. It's in English. I will translate it to Portuguese myself at some point. The idea is to sell the book with the documentary for people to. I think the book just in more depth of what the documentary cannot touch because it's only 90 minutes, right? So we're going to
Right.
use some of that information on there. But I'm not against maybe having a director's cut, like an added 20, 30 minutes, a couple years from now. I'm not against it. I think it's something that we can definitely look into. It's just a lot of work, man.
We all want.
Yeah, but it's easy to say. Here's the thing though, man, like realistically, most documentaries don't break even. Most documentaries are not profitable, but that majority are they don't even break even. So I have an obligation of, paying back the investor, right? And I
Yeah.
meet that obligation. So I have to, even though this has always been a passion project, it's not something I ever plan to make money from. I do feel like I have a debt towards the investor, and I'd like to meet that.
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of like, technicalities and little stuff that don't show. We just want to watch like a movie and learn, but like what goes into like a few seconds of the movie can take like a million years maybe. Yeah, so I understand there's a lot of issues that you might run into, and that's why it's still taking a bit of time. And we also had the crisis, like the whole world was shut down. So I can see that it's not easy to produce such a piece of work.
Well, it's the main thing is what to remove, what to leave. It's there are too many overlapping topics. It's not chronological in the sense where it's easy to tell, the story of you or me because we can go chronologically, right? The story of a person, but they're talking about a story of an art, and doing that chronologically is not exactly easy. I'll give you an example. So one thing we touch on, not we don't go in depth into it, but is fake fights, right? Or the role of Vale Tudo / MMA in the development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It has been throughout. It is not something that only existed in a particular period of time, even though it was more common in a particular period of time. But if it's been throughout and it played a role in maintaining these guys financially stable enough to practice what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where do I mention it? Because there's not a day where it starts and a day where it ends. It's kind of like it's always been part of the scene. So it's very difficult to fit it into the narrative without it being too awkward. Like, where do you fit it? When I'm talking about Helios fight with Ono, it wasn't fake. Where do I put it? Did I talk it up after George Gracie's Valetudo fight with Tico Soledad? Do I talk it before or after Kosen Judo?
Yeah,
Santa Maria, who wasn't even a fighter, but he was instrumental because he was the guy who funded the whole operation, right? So it's like, where do you put all these pieces that don't really match, but all put together, they make the whole. It's like we have a much bigger puzzle, but we're only allowed to use some pieces of the puzzle because we don't have time to use all the pieces we have. So with that being said,
unfortunately.
it's incredibly difficult to piece it all together. So the decision we made, and we're still making that decision, is one of sticking to the main events and characters that made BJJ possible. But it's I would love to dig more into that early Kodokan days, but we can't. We have like a 10-minute segment on Jigoro Kano and judo, and then we move on because it's just way too much to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. There's just so much. Like the challenges alone of the Kodokan, I covered them on my channel. You have the Four Guardians, the Totsuka Yoshinryu Kodokan rivalry for in the police academy. You have challenges at the Butoku Kai. This is all this, and we're not even still in the 1900s. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's like a huge stretch of challenges and rule changes. For example, before there was no time limit, there was no rules. Basically, why the throw ends the match? Because in the old days, they would go unconscious, they would suffer concussions. There's a story, Yokoyama, one of the Four Guardians, grabbed the head, like the face of his challenger, put it against the beam, and kept crushing it until the timer went off. Like as soon as they mentioned that they introduced time limits, he grabbed his head, put it into the beam, and the time went off. But I mean, there's just way too much to talk about evolution challenges, the sequence of the people, how they created the art. Hajime Isogai, he's the father of Kosen Judo, then took Oda under his wing. There's just way too much, and that's not even before 1910s.
And to me, that's a documentary in and of itself, right?
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
that is a docu-series right there because that's such a rich history. And like I admittedly know very little about it. But like there's so many different ways to tackle the history of MMA because we talk about it a little bit, but that's a whole history right there too. That's a documentary itself. Carlson Gracie. I mean, I can guarantee you we're going to get some flack over the fact that we don't have Carlson Gracie in the film. And he was one of the most important characters in history, if not the most important Gracie. He was up there, top 3 for sure. But where do we fit him in? Like we don't cover it. We don't go that far into that period, So, it's. I feel like we don't mention Sataki. I think we might be able to mention him by name at some point.
Toshihiro.
Yeah, I mean, Okura, Raku. Like I would love to talk about these guys, right? But it's the story of immigration and these early Japanese practitioners in Brazil, the Maeda troop, the Konji Koma troop, the Japanese troop, right?
Yeah.
That's a documentary in itself too. Like that's such a rich history there. It's a shame. Like there's no way we can fit everything. But I think the goal has always been to create a bridge between what we do know, right, and the practitioner who just doesn't know anything. And I think all the hints will be there. If you want to pursue this or that aspect of the story, what the documentary will accomplish, I believe, is give the viewer the hints to pursue on their own if they really want to learn more about any aspect of this story.
Yeah, there's so much, and every point can be like not exploited, but expanded on into like its own story, its own like interesting narrative, and just so much rich history. For example, Maeda and Tomita were there since the early 1900s, like 1908. He met Gastão supposedly in 1917. So that's 9 years of doing demonstrations. They were challenged by wrestlers, football players. That alone is a movie.
Yeah. Maeda is a very interesting. They're all interesting. Like every single one of them, I feel is it's this is it's they are all interesting. This story is fascinating because it's a story of globalization too. It's not just it's a story like look at the elements of this story. It is a story of globalization as well. It's a story of immigration. It's a story of you know Commodore Perry opening the ports in Japan for Japan to modernize. Like all these things. It's such a great story, but what's so sad is that the official narrative, right? Like that linear, simplistic Kano, Maeda, Carlos, Helio frame pictures on the wall, right? Every
Yeah.
gender. It's so poor. It's not that it's not true, even though it's Maeda was never a student of Jigoro Kano. You know this.
He was under Tomita's wing.
No, there's a book that talks about this craze by Roberto Pedreira. It's available on Amazon. If you have Shockey is talking about Brazil. Craze talks about the period that we were discussing, Japan prior to Kodokan and the early Kodokan, right? And the Japanese, the jiu-jitsu boom early of the 20th century in Europe and US. But it's a great read. But like he claimed.
Excuse me for 1 second. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah.
He makes the case. He claims that there might have had 4 instructors in Japan. Tomita was not one of them. But I have heard Tomita my whole life as well. So it's worth looking into. And I might have taught him at some point, but it's interesting.
He's the first disciple. Tomita is the first student of Jigoro Kano. The first one to ever become a judoka. The first black belt was Tomita.
Yeah, but I think that Tomita never taught Maeda is what Pedreira is saying in his book, right? So you check it out. I wouldn't know the primary source.
That's interesting because they left together.
I wouldn't know. I think they traveled together, but like I think he had different instructors in Japan.
Yeah.
It's called Craze. It's on Amazon. You can look it up. There's an article about it. It's 20 myths about Maeda. If you Google it, it should come up. 20 myths about Maeda.
Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
Like I think that's where he mentions the 4 Japanese who taught Maeda. I can't remember their names. But it's interesting because Maeda is Maeda's such a fascinating guy. But it's funny. I just remember this now. When we interviewed Robson Gracie, I asked him, what is the importance of Carlos Gracie in jiu-jitsu? And he goes, he's the patriarch of the Gracie family now, like Carlos' son. And then he goes, if it weren't for my dad, who would be Maeda? He'd be a legend at the Amazon. That's what he said. He'd be a legend at the Amazon. No one would ever heard of him. And that was like, wow, that's such a great point. It was Carlos who created Maeda, not the other way around.
Yeah, he is this mystified person, in my opinion. There's just so much that is not true. For example, the whole Carlos being his favorite student, all that stuff is just not true.
He was blown out of proportion to give Carlos's narrative credentials, right? Like, and then later they needed a link to Japan, so Maeda became that link, right? But Maeda's not teaching that much when he's in Brazil. Like, he got blown a little out of proportion. He's mostly retired when he's there. But it's interesting. When I was at the Kodokan Museum, we interviewed Sensei Naoki Murata, who just passed away recently. He's the curator of the Kodokan Museum. And it's interesting that there's a picture there. I think it's Sataki, Akitaro Ono, Maeda, and the other one is it
Gunji Koizumi?
No, it might have been. Who was the other one? There's a 4th one. Anyway, I can't remember. It's a picture in the Kodokan.
Yamashita? No, he taught the president.
No, it wasn't Yamashita. It's in Brazil. This picture was taken in Brazil. I'm gonna go with. I think it might have been Tomita. Who's the other older Japanese that was with Maeda in Brazil early? Tokoguro Ito.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And he taught Joe Omori, no?
I wouldn't know. From my understanding, Joe Mori went from Kodokan to Europe, United States, and then Brazil. I don't know anything about who taught him. I never really looked at it, but it might have been. But it's interesting
Yeah.
that the picture of Maeda in the Kodokan Museum, right? Because they're honoring that piece of their story, of their history. And I was remember thinking to myself, like after like, you know, the Hobson interview was still ringing in my mind, I'm going, would that picture be there if it were not for Carlos Gracie? Would Kodokan remember Maeda if it were not for Carlos Gracie? And I'm thinking, I don't think they would. Because Maeda was one of many Japanese who traveled. Like, why did Maeda? Because Maeda was made this special character to give the story of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a creation story, right? Like he wasn't like if you Google Japanese immigration, right, in Brazil,
Yeah.
Japanese immigration in Brazil, you know what the first picture comes up on Google?
Maeda.
Maeda. He's the most famous Japanese immigrant. You think
Wow.
that would be the case had Carlos Gracie never been born, right? You think that would be the case?
So it's a reverse. It's an inverted relationship. It's not the like the way we think of it. It's actually the reverse. So he blew him out of proportion to give himself some credential and credibility, and hence Maeda was mystified the way he is today. Not mystified, but you know, became renowned.
He became what gave, you know, the Brazilian version of judo credibility, because they needed a link. And I think that is, as you know, early on, it's not something they talked about all the time. Like this whole, it's the 90s is when like they had to start really explaining their origins to the world. Up to then, it was not something, Brazilians are not particular about this. Like you don't see pictures of Carlos and Helio on the wall in any gym in Brazil. When you tell Brazilians that, look, you know, there's an exaggeration here, these things were omitted, they were distorted, Brazilians are like, yeah, duh. Like they're more, it's not, I don't know if it's partly, it's not something that is shocking over there, right? But in the
Yeah.
US, the Rorion was so brilliant at marketing his brand of jiu-jitsu that the story became very ingrained. And from then onwards, they start, like, we have to, you know, Maeda is the man who creates a link between, you know, our present and our, you know, our judo past. But in reality, what does Maeda actually do? For all practical purposes, what does he do in Brazil? Not that much.
He helped the Japanese settle during the diaspora. He wanted to make a living by prize fighting.
Yeah,
and he established his judo to his school, which is still open today, to make a living, basically.
Yeah, but like he doesn't have like, for example, you know, Gio Mori fought way more than he did. You know, I mean, he was younger too. Maeda's practically retired. I'm not saying Maeda didn't do anything, but I think that, you know, his role has been a little exaggerated. Like just so we're not swing to one extreme or the other. My view is that, you know, of course he's relevant, of course he belongs, of course, in fact he's central, but I don't think he actually did that much because he's barely teaching. Like, he teaches for a few years, he promotes some Brazilians, and it's very clear that he takes a back seat and gives the reins to Jacinto Ferro, who most likely was Carlos's teacher and so on. But he takes a step back because he's just more interested in Japanese immigration at that point. Honestly, it's probably for financial reasons too. You know, you're going
Wait,
like,
I have
more money. You know, it's, I'm going to make more money being the ambassador for Japanese immigration in Brazil, you know, or am I going to be making money teaching jiu-jitsu to half a dozen people?
yeah. Someone recently asked me a question. I found it very interesting. If Maeda was touring, when did he find the time to teach both Jacinto and Donato?
So, well, he did not teach Donato. Donato was a student of Jacinto Ferro as well.
Oh,
Claimed
okay.
to be a student of Maeda. He claimed to have a diploma. Maybe he had. Maybe he did train with Maeda, but we don't know. Right? It's a diploma. Oh, it's clear that the diploma did exist because there's a reporter who's like talking about looking at the diploma. So he's clearly seeing it, but we don't know what it was, right? So that's like kind of the question open to, you know, did he really train with Maeda? But he claimed he did. But Maeda, right, like Maeda wasn't teaching that much because he does travel, like he's active with Japanese immigration. And, you know, you can see Jacinto Ferro taking over that position. I suspect that he taught class every now and then, but he's probably tired of it too. You got to remember, he's like, what, mid 40s now, and he's kind of like, I'm ready to do something else. He's been training, fighting, and traveling his whole life. I can see him, slowly giving, the reins of the gym that he started, but to other students, primarily Jacinto Ferro.
Okay, yeah, that makes
And
yeah,
it's
that
common
makes
in all
sense.
gyms, really. That's not unusual. Like, I don't teach all the classes in my gym.
Of course not.
I mean, now I'm teaching beginners, but I rarely teach beginners. I normally teach advanced and, the MMA guys and whatnot. But I think that's common for once you're 50 and 60 years old. You teach 1, 2, 3 classes a week, and you let your main students teach the other classes. I think that's the
Yes.
story of every gym in the world. So I think it's reasonable to speculate that that is the case at Maeda's gym in Belém do Pará as well.
Yeah, it's so amazing. The stuff that like there's things that still happen till this day. It won't change. Like the class thing, the hierarchy, like the mechanism of teaching uh, stays the same. So uh, I was gonna ask something I forgot. So so it's mainly in Brazil, the movie. It's not, so there's a small part in Japan and the rest is all in Brazil, or there's also the California with Orion and everything that happened.
We tried interviewing. Like, we had many interviews that we didn't get, right? Like Horian was one, Hala was the other. A few researchers in Brazil, Pedreira, Midi, who would not be interviewed by us. Like, we missed out, like, some people that we really wanted to talk to. In hindsight is always 2020. I would have added a lot more people to that list of interviewees. I would have removed some other people. I think I would have
Hmm.
been more careful about who we interviewed, and we probably gotten more out of some people than others. So in that sense, some regrets. But in Brazil, we had interviews in Sao Paulo, Rio, Brasilia, and Belém do Pará. And then in Japan, we had Tokyo, Kyoto, Okayama. And in the US, we only had 3 interviews. We had more. No, sorry, we had 5. Carlos Gracie Jr., Chris Hoyter, or Howder, Valenti brothers, Royce Gracie,
Oh,
and Daniele Bolelli. So 5 interviews, 6 if you count Valenti brothers. Both brothers were interviewed, so 6 people. And that was done in 1, 2, 3 trips. 2 to California and 1 to Florida. And then, but
oh,
most of the interviews are in Brazil. That's where most of the grandmasters are and researchers.
okay. And this is a big question for me. You're, I don't know if what I'm saying is correct, but you're kind of like challenging the status quo with this film. Did you get some sort of a resistance or some sort of a like a backlash or some sort?
I think I might have some personally. I think overall it's been positive. But it's funny. I'm not going to mention names, but there's someone who's very close to me, very good friend of mine. He's very well known in the fight world. You would know him from BJJ, from the UFC. And I asked him as a favor if he would post like one of our posters right on his Instagram to promote the documentary, right? And he wouldn't do it because I have too many friends in the Gracie family. I want them to get mad at me. And I'm like, God, that's kind of, I understand everyone's different. Like, to me, I'm like, grow some cojones, man. Like, that's my way of looking at things. But I don't think there's going to be anything major. Here's the thing, like, in terms of history, and I'm not a professional historian. I have a bachelor's in history. I have an unfinished master's. I love history. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of sources, there's no debate to be had. There isn't. Let's be frank. Like, how are you going to come back? Like, oh, no, no,
I
Robert.
agree.
Yeah, you're wrong. This is really what happened. I'm like, unless someone finds a treasure trove of sources out there that change the what we now know, like the more recent narrative, I just don't see how they could argue in an intelligent way. Like, I just don't see how they could counter what we're trying to do. So the only alternative is to ignore. So I don't fear being sued. I don't feel flack so much as I feel that people, especially the big media outlets, go out of their way to ignore it because it's not a convenient narrative. And but I will say this though, man, like, even when we spoke to people like Hobson Gracie and Carlos Gracie Jr., the Valenti brothers, these were people that are like either Gracies, or people that are very invested in the Gracie name. They seem rather open, man. Like they weren't that close. I think that because deep down they know that they didn't really know their history that well, and that what we're saying is accurate, and you have to accept it. Like, what are you going to do about it? You can't argue with it. They're facts. So it's more of a question. The question is like, oh, is this going to change our reputation, our standing in the fight world? And if as long as there's present standing doesn't change, I don't think they'll be that bothered. I think they would be bothered if their present standing suffered, and I don't think it will. And I think they know that it won't, so they're not too worried about anything in the past being changed. The die is cast. We've walked too much,
Yeah.
it is what it is. And no matter what we find about the past now, it won't change BJJ's standings in the world today significantly. The end result is what it is. But it does blow the wind out of the sails of Carlos and Helio a little bit, and it's because they were so central. Maeda, the three of them, right? They were so central in the official narrative that there's no way that having a more complete understanding of all of this is not going to blow someone out of their sail. It's going to happen. There's no way out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the evidence is staring you in the face. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, I fear being ignored, I guess. This is why I do ask people to, not for ego reasons, I like to pay the investor back. But I think it's too rich of a story for people not to know. So that's why I ask like people to help us promote organically, because at this point, I can't count on major news outlets to help me promote. This will be organic, guerrilla marketing, me, you, and our friends kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was ready for this from the beginning. It's something I expected, to be frank.
Yeah. That's the thing with the mainstream media, even like MMA till this day, like people think it's just like people smashing each other. It's still like socially, it's still a bit. I mean, we talk about it all the time, all day, every day. We think we're used to it, but the people just outside, even other martial artists looking into MMA, to them it's just way too much. So UFC and all the stuff that are in the mainstream, it's still a bit, after almost 30 years now, still not as much as accepted. So I wouldn't be surprised as the movie was like almost like a subculture, because not a lot of us, even like practitioners, are not just that much into the history and what happened. Like a lot of people tell me, the move works. What happened a million years ago doesn't interest me. What matters now?
Yeah. I think that's such poverty, though. When I hear people saying that, it's so poor. I used to get angry like that. Now I kind of feel sorry for them. Like, man, the view I have is not that you're seeing things from like a little tiny cliff, man. Like digging into this story, it's like you're standing on top of a mountain now. Like, oh man, I see martial arts completely. And I'm not saying I have the full scope. I'm not saying there aren't higher cliffs, but there's a lot to understand still. But it's breathtaking, being able to question your roots and understand your identity and understand the past. So you can understand the future, the present and the future. It's or idea have like a vision for the future at least. I don't try to insist with people the importance of history, man. Like it is what it is. Like I used to be more like trying to argue with people. Now,
Yeah.
hey man, don't give pearls to pigs. That's how I look at it. Like
Yeah, that's what the Bible says. Yeah.
Yeah, don't give pearls to pigs. And it's a good quote, man. Like in my jiu-jitsu class, for example, my MMA guys don't want to train in the gi. I never insist. I strongly believe that training the gi makes your game sharper, in the sense where it's harder to move when someone's holding you down. There's a reason why the best finishers, best technicians on the ground have always come from the gi. Like with very rare exceptions. But I don't insist. I'll give them my opinion. Like, this is what I think you should do, but I don't insist, because it's one of those things, man. I know what I'm talking about. You should trust me. If you don't, that's on you. That's not on me. The history is out there. Right? It's out there. The facts are the facts. History is interesting. It's fascinating. It gives us identity. not remembering, losing your memory, you would lose sense of who you are. That's what would happen.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. If we don't have memory and you think I'm perfectly happy not having memory and just living in the moment, man, that must be a happy existence, but it's also very poor. You know, maybe
Yeah.
it's free. I can't imagine. I mean, no one could ever know everything, but not having a curiosity about who you are, to me, is so strange. Jiu-jitsu is part of my identity. Therefore, understanding that identity follows. It's not even a question. I don't. I think history is poorly presented. It's part of it's school. I think it's an educational problem too. Like the way it's taught in school is in a way that they can't relate to it. Like people miss is that people think that dates and names are all that matter. Who cares about a date and a name? It's
It's the open discussions and
it's learning how to interpret facts like that. It's a fascinating exercise, man. It's such a fun exercise. Like you're given information and you have to solve the puzzle with information you're given. That's fun, you know.
yes,
But
connecting the dots.
connecting the dots, exactly, and we can disagree on our conclusions and having a debate about that. I think that's fascinating. But I think people have the perception that history is about memorizing dates, and it really isn't.
No.
Like you can tell. I say all the time, I don't remember, and I don't really care about remembering because I don't think that's that important. I think it's good to know as a curiosity thing, but it doesn't. What's really important is to develop the ability to interpret information, right? And you
Yeah.
do that through lots of practice. I mean, but people differ.
Yeah, I'm an architect, and we took a total of 6 courses of history in school, 2 history of arts and 4 history of architecture, and they were all like long discussions and dissertations. I'm talking about the exams, I'm talking about the papers. You use some examples of a castle that was built or a sculpture that was made in order to get a point across, but that's it. Everything else is like a very long and detailed discussion. That's what I learned.
Yeah, no, and it's a fun discussion, but I think that the problem is, and this is something I identified when I was at UNLV. I mentioned I have an unfinished master's, right? And
Yeah.
I think there's a strong disconnect in between the academic world and the public, and that is a huge problem because, and it permeates politics too, at least in the U.S. When you say if you're an intellectual, an academic, Americans view that with suspicion. It's almost like it's a bad that sort of thing. Like, oh, these are the greatest minds in the world. You wouldn't want to listen to them, right? But there's such a
Yeah.
match between the general public and the academic world, and there's zero communication. It seems like because it's boring, or the public isn't trained enough to understand what is being done to the point where they're viewed with suspicion. Like it's like, oh, you don't really know what you're talking about. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know what they're talking about, right? And
Yeah.
it's kind of like insulting in some way that someone spends so much time researching the same topic and someone would feel so confident that they would say that the other person doesn't know what they're talking about. So that disconnect is a huge problem. I don't know if there's a solution, but it's very bureaucratic, and I think in terms of education, history is poorly taught. So I think it comes from school, really. It comes from school. I think
Yeah. That's
people are taught history. It makes it something incredible. Because I didn't like history in school. I hated it in school, but as an adult, I came to love it. So, you know.
yeah. You in school basically you regurgitate this like entire paragraph and you get an A. It's not that's not how it works.
You're not taught how to think. You're taught how to repeat.
Regurgitate. Yeah.
That and thinking is a fun exercise, and I think that once you teach children that thinking is a challenging and thrilling exercise, and that they should teach them how to interpret information, I think people would fall in love with it. But like, no one wants to memorize dates. That really isn't fun.
It's Mr. History is a puzzle and an intellectual debate. This is my conclusion.
Yeah, and it's and I but everyone's different, man. If every person in the world were an innate historian, the world probably wouldn't be that great. I think this is probably a good thing that we're all different. But I have a hard time understanding someone that doesn't have that curiosity.
Yeah, I think we all have a hard time, but regardless, the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know, and it's an ongoing thing.
Well, we do our part, like that's everyone does
Yeah.
their part. You doing yours, I'm doing mine, and people out there like are trying to get the story out there. Uh, I think that at the end, man, like I think at the end it might take 5, 10, 15 years, but the narrative will be corrected. It's just a matter of time. And
Yeah,
it will be rewritten, and it's just a matter of time before it happens. I think overall, it's gonna be different. It's an uphill battle, but it's gonna take place.
yeah. That's amazing. That this whole conversation was just mind blowing. Thank you so much. Uh, I these are my questions basically. Do you have any like a statement or anything to add?
Uh, I can't think of anything. Um, well, I would like people to support the film. Help promote it, as best as everyone can, and talk about it. Do your own research. Like, and one thing, I would like people to do is, don't necessarily agree with some of the conclusions of the film, but if you think they're incorrect, look into it, and draw your own conclusions. And I think if you're a martial artist, you should have a fundamental understanding of your history. Like I've seen curriculums that have history in it, like the history of their martial art. I think that's probably a good thing. I think we should have that. Maybe we'll change it. Maybe 5 years from now, we'll develop a BJJ curriculum, and what we're talking about now will be in that curriculum. There will be a new official narrative, right? Uh,
Yeah,
but I don't know, just have people support. Uh, watch. I hope people enjoy it. It's been a lot of work. It's
for sure.
been very stressful. There's a part of me like when I was filming, it's like, oh man, I want to do this again. This is so much fun, Now I'm like, I don't know if
Yeah,
I got
yeah.
like
I
I just don't have
yeah.
the breath to go through everything again, But it's kind of like having a kid, It's amazing. But
Yeah.
once you're grown, you're like, do I really want to do this all over again? I don't know.
Yeah,
Uh,
I recently posted a video. It's called "The Importance of Robert Drysdale," and I was talking about the film. I put a little clip where you talk about Coast Judo and how it's gonna help paint a clear image, a blueprint for the like how you said it's a blueprint for the future generations, etc. And every single comment was positive. It's either I can't wait. When is it coming out? He's doing such a good job. I cannot like that's so good. He's challenging the mainstream narrative. Everyone is supporting this idea, myself included. I'm sure you're sick of hearing this question, but will it be out anytime soon?
oh, question that begs an answer, isn't it? Um, we have a cut, right? It's missing subtitles, and the intro and the ending are something that we're going back and forth on. Like we're trying to like adjust it.
Yeah,
We had a bumpy road due to personal issues on our team in the sense where like there's a lot happened in the last 3 years in everyone's personal life, right? So everything has been, it's not all easy. Like normally these productions are a team of like 20 people. We're down to
yeah.
started with 6, 2 of them we lost 2 along the way, so we're down.
Uh,
And my job really is doing what I'm doing now is talking to you guys, trying to promote the film. I don't have, I mean, I review all the new cuts and the script and all that, but I don't, most of the work falls on the editing team now. And editing is very, very time consuming, right? We made a promise to the fans that we would be out before the end of the summer. Summer ends in September, so we're good.
yeah,
We
we can wait. We can wait that long.
we will definitely have English, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese, and Spanish versions, possibly Polish as well as a huge following, maybe French at some point. Um, the idea is to make an archival film for the martial arts community. That's the goal. I don't know if we're going to accomplish it, man. I'm not holding my breath. Like I am very enthusiastic about the nature of what we created. I am confident, I'm happy, and I'm proud of that.
Yeah,
We will have, 'cause I am so bad at marketing. I'm so bad at it. Like if there's one thing I wish I could improve on is marketing. But every time I pick up a book on marketing, it makes me
yeah.
like someone gave me that. What is it? The How to Influence People the other day, Dale Carnegie. I'm like three pages in, and I can't finish it, man. Like I can't. It's not for me, man. Like I try to read business books, and I just can't. I can't do it. I suck at it. So that part, I won't worry about my inability to accomplish these things. But I think that we have such a niche, and we got so many people that are on our side, so many people like yourself that are supporting that. I think it might be a hit, but I'm ready for whatever, man. And regardless, I'm proud. Like, I hit or no hit, I'm content.
I'm very optimistic in my opinion. It's gonna first of all vindicate the real history, and also it's gonna not revolutionize, it's gonna change things for the good, and also what you're doing is a great like feat of accomplishment, and it's gonna be remembered decades down the road, and people will thank you not just for your record in MMA and Jiu-Jitsu, but also for this incredible piece of work. Like we were talking about Kano, what really surged judo into the mainstream, and this is how he was an intellectual rather than he was a martial artist. And you kind of did both, and we are very grateful to have someone like you putting this much effort into all of this. We truly thank you on behalf of everyone who trains and looking forward to this film. We thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. Yeah, man, it's been a fun ride, and I'm enjoying it. So,
Yeah.
hard but fun. And no, I thank you guys. Thank you for the opportunity. Maybe we'll do another one once you watch the film. We can talk about it. We'll do this again.
Definitely.
And yeah, I'm always here. So you got my number. Hit me up.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much once again. This was a great conversation. We talked film, we talked rules, history, everything, not just the standard question. Again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's an honor for me to have this conversation with you, Mr. Drysdale. I truly thank you.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. All right, we'll keep in touch. Hopefully, it's gonna come out soon, and we'll have a talk after it comes out.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.